Before modern medicine emerged, humans lived for thousands of years in a world where illness was unavoidable, yet not understood in the way we understand it today. This video does not aim to present a history of medicine, nor to catalog ancient remedies. Instead, it focuses on a more fundamental question. When people fell ill in medieval society, how did they understand that experience? How did they live with physical weakening? And how did the surrounding community organize everyday life in response to illness? Let us begin with a simple imagined scene. You are ill. Not a major accident, not a clearly named disease. Just a lingering fever, a heavy body, a foggy mind, scattered coughing when the air turns cold. In the modern world, the instinctive response is immediate. What is wrong with me? What is the cause? What must be done to return to normal? For most of human history, especially in the medieval period, this way of asking the question did not exist. Not because people were less intelligent, but because illness was not understood as a disruption. It was not something outside of life, breaking an otherwise stable order. It was part of that order itself. For ordinary medieval people, daily life was built upon conditions we would now consider long-term disadvantages. Physically demanding labor, unstable nutrition, cold and damp housing, small wounds that never fully healed, recurrent infections tied to the seasons. In such a context, a perfectly healthy body was not the norm, it was the exception. The true baseline was not being free of illness, but having enough strength to continue living. As a result, sickness did not automatically carry the meaning of crisis. It did not immediately provoke panic or demand urgent intervention. An illness became a problem only when it crossed a familiar threshold, when a person could no longer work the fields, practice their craft, attend religious rituals, or when prolonged weakness began to threaten the livelihood of the entire household. Here, illness was not measured by symptoms, but by disrupted social function. This is why medieval people did not ask, "Why am I sick?" in a biological sense. They did not search for a specific pathogen, nor did they attempt to isolate illness from the broader fabric of life in order to treat it separately. Their questions operated on a different level. Has the body fallen out of balance? Has daily life drifted away from its accustomed rhythm? Is something misaligned in the relationship between the individual, the community, and the sacred order? In this world, illness was neither random nor meaningless. It carried explanatory weight. It was a sign, not only of the body, but of the entire way a human life was situated within its environment. The body was not understood as a biological machine that could be taken apart and repaired piece by piece. It was part of a larger order, shaped by climate, emotion, daily rhythm, morality, and belief. When the body weakened, it did not speak only about the individual. It reflected the condition of the life surrounding them. For this reason, a sick person was not viewed as a medical case, but as a weakening link within a shared order. Illness did not remove someone from the community. On the contrary, it made that connection more visible. The sick were seen, known, and kept among others, not to be cured in the modern sense, but so that suffering would not be borne alone. There was no concept of medical privacy as we understand it today. But in exchange, there was also no total isolation of the sick. Care was not defined by therapeutic efficiency, but by the continuous presence of others. All of this leads to a fundamental difference in how pain itself was understood. Illness was not an enemy to be defeated at all costs. It was a condition of life, something to be endured, lived alongside, and adapted to. Recovery, when it happened, did not mean returning to a previous state, but finding a new rhythm within newly imposed limits. Without understanding this framework, we inevitably misread the past. We assume medieval people were ignorant, passive, or resigned. In reality, they were acting rationally within the world they inhabited, a world in which illness was not an exception, but a familiar and expected part of human existence. Mourning, in the context of medieval life, rarely begins with a clearly recognized moment of falling ill. Physical weakness usually emerges gradually, difficult to separate from the familiar exhaustion caused by labor, weather, and prolonged deprivation. One wakes more slowly than usual, not out of an intention to rest, but because the body responds more sluggishly to movements that have long since become habitual. This sense of deviation from the norm is not interpreted through medical language. There is no framework for classification, nor any urgency to analyze it in detail. What must be determined early and with absolute practicality is whether the body can still participate in the ordinary rhythm of life. Can this body, in its current state, still work? That is the central question. This question has little to do with diagnosis or recovery. It is directly tied to the individual's place within the familiar chain of family and community functioning. If the body still responds, even more slowly, one continues. If it does not, the rhythm of life is adjusted, but rarely brought to a complete stop. At this stage, illness does not force life to halt. It forces life to proceed at a reduced pace. As the day moves on, weakness becomes more noticeable to those around. Yet this recognition is not medical in nature. There is no systematic inquiry into symptoms, no search for a specific cause. Judgments are formed through accumulated experience, the degree of fatigue, the slowness of response, the ability to complete tasks. In a closely knit society, a body that falls out of rhythm is difficult to hide, but it is also not scrutinized as a personal problem requiring immediate intervention. Concern, when it appears, is expressed through very small adjustments in daily organization, reducing heavy tasks, allowing earlier withdrawal, or simply refraining from adding new demands. This is not care in the sense of treatment, but communal adaptation to a weakening body. The shared order does not seek to repair that body. It seeks to continue functioning around its weakness. At mealtime, illness becomes more visible. Portions that are already limited now become difficult to consume, not because of intentional restriction, but because the body can no longer take in food as before. Eating less leads to prolonged fatigue, forming a slow loop of hunger, weakness, and rest. In the absence of nutritional knowledge, this is not seen as a problem requiring correction, but as an acceptable consequence of physical decline. In the afternoon, as labor eases, illness becomes more present in conscious awareness. Without activity to distract attention, the sick person feels the body's limits more clearly. Heavy breathing, a dull headache, a persistent sense of cold. Yet even now, illness is not understood as something that must be treated. It is placed alongside other adverse living conditions, bad weather, unstable harvests, factors that people are accustomed to enduring rather than controlling. Anxiety, if it arises, rarely centers on the risk of death, Instead, it focuses on concrete and social consequences, disruption of labor, threats to livelihood, and the ability to maintain one's customary role within the community. Illness, therefore, is not only a bodily experience, but a potential threat to the social order in which the individual is embedded. When night falls, weakness becomes more pronounced in cold, dim dwellings. Sleep is often fragmented, but the sick person is rarely entirely alone. The presence of others, even without therapeutic intent, plays an important role in sustaining endurance. In this context, illness does not equate to absolute isolation. The day ends without any assessment of progress in a medical sense. There is no scale by which improvement or deterioration can be measured. The only certainty is that the body has made it through another day, at a greater cost than usual. Life continues, but at a slower and more fragile pace. It is the repetition of such days that becomes decisive. A single day of illness does not create crisis. But when weakness persists, when it is no longer seen as temporary, and when the ability to sustain one's social role is threatened, illness gradually shifts from a personal experience into a condition that demands explanation and response. It is at this point that accumulated experience, folk remedies, and the roles of those regarded as knowledgeable about illness begin to enter daily life more visibly, not as medical professionals in the modern sense, but as figures who interpret and adjust deviations within a familiar order. When weakness persists long enough to pass the familiar threshold of endurance, illness is no longer seen merely as an adverse condition of life. It enters the realm of phenomena that require intervention. Yet, intervention, in the pre-modern context, does not carry the technical meaning it does today. It is not aimed at eliminating a clearly identified biological cause, but at correcting a state understood to be out of alignment with a proper order. The point of departure for any intervention is not the question, "What disease is this?" but rather, "What has fallen out of balance?" In the medieval understanding, the body does not function like a machine whose individual parts can fail independently. It is conceived as a system governed by 4 fundamental humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health exists when these elements maintain relative harmony. Illness appears when that harmony is disrupted. Within this framework, sickness is not the result of being infected by an external agent, but a sign of internal imbalance, shaped simultaneously by environment, lifestyle, emotions, and moral order. For this reason, the task of healing is not to attack the illness, but to restore the disturbed balance. This approach leads to an important consequence. 2 people may display very similar symptoms, yet receive entirely different diagnoses and forms of intervention. This is not seen as a contradiction, because each person is understood to possess a distinct constitution, a unique life history, and a fundamentally different kind of imbalance. A fever, for example, is not understood simply as elevated body temperature. It is interpreted as an excess of heat throughout the system, calling for cooling measures, steam baths, dietary adjustments toward cold foods, or bloodletting to reduce the excess. By contrast, prolonged states of melancholy or heaviness of spirit are often associated with an accumulation of black bile, and thus addressed through light, music, prayer, or other forms of spiritual support. In this view, the body is not a purely biological entity, but a moral, emotional, physical ecosystem in which changes in mental life and social conditions can manifest directly as bodily weakness. The knowledge required to interpret and intervene in such imbalances is not widely accessible. It exists in oral form and is socially stratified, closely tied to status and moral authority. Not everyone is considered entitled or qualified to offer medical advice. Those who hold this knowledge are typically clergy, healers, older women associated with childbirth and household care, or individuals recognized by the community for their lived experience of survival. The sick do not seek information in the modern sense. They do not consult manuals, search references, or compare treatments. They listen to those regarded as authoritative, not only for their knowledge, but for their position within the spiritual and social order. A recommendation for healing may therefore begin with phrases entirely natural to that world. The priest says, "My grandmother used to do this," or even references to movements believed to exert external influence, such as the shifting of the planets. Within this framework, such elements are not considered irrational, because illness is not separated from the cosmic order in which people believe they live. Medical knowledge, therefore, cannot be separated from spiritual authority. Who receives which advice and how much weight that advice carries depends on the relationship between knowledge, faith, and communal structure. Healing is not only an action directed at the body. It is a process of reaffirming order. Who has the right to interpret, who is expected to comply, and how the community accepts that interpretation as legitimate. Alongside bodily interventions, faith continues to play an inseparable role. In the pre-modern world, the boundary between healing and prayer is almost non-existent. Confession, prayer, pilgrimage, carrying relics, or participating in collective rituals are not alternative choices, but different layers of intervention applied to the same state of disorder. This combination is not seen as contradictory. Treating the body while ignoring spiritual life is considered incomplete. Yet praying without adjusting the body or one's way of life is also seen as irresponsible. Body and soul are not separate entities, and responses to illness must therefore operate on both planes. What must be emphasized is that the goal of these interventions is rarely full recovery in the modern sense. There is no expectation that the body will return to its former state. What is sought instead is relative stability, enough strength to continue existing, enough capacity to maintain one's role, or, if that is no longer possible, at least a process of decline that is orderly, witnessed, and accepted by the community. Here, the deepest contrast with the modern world becomes clear. When illness carries meaning, when pain is situated within an interpretable order, the need to defeat disease at all costs ceases to be the highest priority. What matters more is how one lives with illness, and how the community organizes life around that shared fragility. When weakness no longer remains confined to a single individual, but begins to repeat itself across many bodies at the same time, illness takes on a different meaning. It is no longer understood as an isolated misalignment, but as a sign that a broader order is malfunctioning. This is the moment contemporaries often described, not in medical terms, but in the language of time, as a season of illness. A season of illness is not necessarily an epidemic in the modern sense. It may consist of a succession of lingering sicknesses appearing more frequently than usual, linked to harsh weather, failed harvests, or prolonged nutritional shortage. What makes it troubling is not an immediate surge in deaths, but the steady erosion of the community's capacity to live. In this context, illness no longer merely slows the rhythm of life. It begins to distort the structure that sustains it. Labor declines across the board. Tasks once shared are increasingly borne by the few who remain strong enough. Shortages accumulate gradually, not explosively, but persistently. Every household has someone weakened, and no one is entirely free to absorb the burden of others. Unlike the response of modern societies, where illness often leads to rest, isolation, and the removal of the sick into separate spaces such as hospitals, pre-modern societies neither possessed the means nor felt the need to separate the ill from communal life. The sick remained at home. They were seen, known, and spoken about, not through medical language, but through social and religious frames of interpretation. During a season of illness, there is no concept of individualized medical care. Instead, what emerges is a collective practice, enduring together. Neighbors know who is weak. Families and communities adjust their rhythms to accommodate the decline. Illness, therefore, is not merely a condition of individual bodies, but a social event, recognized and responded to by the community as a whole. It is precisely in this state that the limits of familiar interventions become visible. Herbs are still used, rituals still performed, healers' advice still followed. Yet any effect becomes difficult to discern, not because these practices are entirely ineffective, but because the situation has moved beyond the scale at which they can make meaningful adjustments. A season of illness exposes a fundamental reality of the pre-modern world. Individual health cannot be separated from collective living conditions. When food supplies diminish, when homes fail to keep out the cold, when labor continues without the possibility of recovery, all bodies are pushed toward their limits. In such circumstances, illness is not a single cause, but a symptom of overlapping imbalances. The community's response, therefore, becomes increasingly collective. Personal rituals are replaced or supplemented by shared ones. Communal prayers, processions with relics, widespread fasting or abstinence. Not because anyone believes a single ritual can reverse the situation, but because the community requires a way to reaffirm order and cohesion amid instability. At the level of daily organization, priorities begin to shift. Not everyone receives care equally. The allocation of resources, though never named as such, occurs naturally and unavoidably. Bodies still capable of labor are kept within the shared rhythm longer. Those who grow too weak are gradually withdrawn from the chain of work, not because they are less valued, but because the community must preserve its overall capacity to endure. This point often unsettles modern sensibilities, yet it is deeply practical in the pre-modern context. The goal is not to maximize survival for every individual, but to sustain the life of the community as a unit. Decisions are not made through written rules or commands, but through habit, unspoken pressure, and collective acceptance. In a season of illness, death becomes more present, but not as sudden or shocking as in an outbreak. It arrives slowly, repeatedly, and is therefore anticipated. Care is offered not only for recovery, but for decline that unfolds in an orderly way. Witnessing, praying, and accompanying the dying become integral parts of the social response to prolonged sickness. Notably, even in this context, illness is still not understood purely as an enemy to be defeated. It is seen as part of a harsh cycle that humans must pass through, much like a long winter or a famine. The difference is that illness touches the body directly, forcing people to confront their limits more intimately. A season of illness, then, is not merely a period of declining health. It is a test of social structure, the strength of communal bonds, the ability to distribute burden, and the ways people seek meaning amid prolonged weakening. Communities that endure are not necessarily those with more effective remedies, but those that maintain order, ritual, and mutual support, even when outcomes cannot be controlled. When a season of illness begins to subside, what remains is not a return to normal in the modern sense. In pre-modern societies, illness rarely ends in full recovery. Instead, it opens onto three parallel possibilities: partial recovery, living with prolonged weakness, or not surviving. All three outcomes are anticipated, not through medical planning, but through familiar social patterns. Recovery, when it occurs, is usually partial. The body may regain enough strength to rejoin daily life, but it seldom returns to its pre-illness state. Diminished endurance, reduced tolerance for exertion, lingering pain, or lasting limitations become the new normal. This is not seen as a failure of healing, because complete restoration was never the goal. What matters is whether the individual can be reabsorbed into the order of life, even if in a different position than before. In many cases, recovery does not mean resuming one's former role. Those who once performed heavy labor may shift to lighter tasks. Responsibilities are redistributed, not through formal decisions, but through gradual communal adjustment. A body that has passed through illness is recognized as more fragile, and this fragility is taken into account in organizing shared life. The second possibility, no less common, is living with illness. This is not a temporary state, but a prolonged condition. Pain, fatigue, restricted movement, or impaired breathing become part of everyday existence. In the absence of a modern concept of chronic disease, such states are not named. They are simply accepted. Living with illness does not mean resignation. It requires continual adaptation, adjusting pace, modifying labor, relying more heavily on family and community support. Survivors are not expected to overcome or defeat their condition. They are expected to live within new limits, and the community, in turn, adapts to accommodate those limits. In such cases, illness becomes part of social identity. It shapes how a person is perceived, not through absolute stigma, but as a factor that must be considered in all interactions. Fragility is not concealed. It is made visible within shared life. The third possibility is not surviving. In pre-modern societies, death from illness is not a rare shock. It occurs frequently enough to be anticipated, ritually and psychologically. When weakness becomes irreversible, the focus of care shifts decisively, from seeking recovery to ensuring an orderly process of decline. At this stage, bodily interventions give way to practices of witnessing and accompaniment. The sick are not isolated. Family and community remain present, not to reverse the outcome, but to affirm that this departure takes place within a meaningful order. Prayer, confession, final words, and preparation for burial move to the center of social response. It is crucial to emphasize that, in this context, death is not understood as a failure, neither of the individual nor of the community. It is a possibility always present in life, activated by illness, age, and living conditions. Not surviving does not negate the value of the life lived, nor does it throw social order into crisis. On the contrary, the rituals surrounding death help restore order, allowing the community to continue after loss. These three possibilities, partial recovery, living with illness, and not surviving, are not sharply distinguished by diagnosis or prognosis. They overlap, transform into one another, and become clear only in retrospect. What they share is a refusal to frame illness as a battle with winners and losers. Instead, illness is understood as a process of living, weakening, adapting, and sometimes ending. It is here that the deepest difference between the pre-modern and modern worlds becomes visible. When illness is not separated from life, its outcomes are not pushed outside the community. Recovery is not a return to an ideal baseline. Living with illness is not a personal failure, and death is not something to be hidden or postponed at all costs. All these outcomes are held within a shared frame of meaning. Life is fragile, finite, and interdependent. Illness, in this role, is not merely a biological state, but a social mechanism, one that reveals human limits and organizes how people live together within those limits. When we place pre-modern experiences of illness alongside the ways people confront disease today, a familiar question often arises: have modern humans become weaker? Yet the way this question is framed already contains a mistaken assumption. The issue is not whether humans are stronger or weaker, but that they have become different, because illness itself has been placed within an entirely different frame of reference. In the modern world, illness is separated from everyday life and relocated into specialized spaces. When people fall ill, they withdraw from shared rhythms and enter standardized processes, surrounded by technology, professional expertise, and privacy. Illness becomes a condition to be managed efficiently, quickly, and, if possible, rendered invisible. This shift has produced undeniable achievements: longer life expectancy, better control of pain, and the treatment or long-term management of diseases that were once fatal. But these achievements come with a profound trade-off. As illness becomes increasingly technologized, it gradually loses its status as a social event. The sick person becomes a clinical case, defined by metrics, test results, and treatment protocols. Elements that once connected illness to community, witnessing, shared endurance, collective ritual, are reduced or disappear altogether. Illness becomes private, and that privacy, while protecting individual dignity, also weakens the social bonds that once formed around human vulnerability. In pre-modern societies, illness was visible. It unfolded in shared spaces, was discussed openly, and interpreted through common languages of meaning. The sick were not removed from the community, but placed within it, accompanied by both support and pressure. Today, illness is shielded from public view. Suffering takes place in private rooms or behind the doors of medical institutions. People are protected from exposure, but are also expected to carry the experience of illness more alone. This change is not merely spatial, it is a change in meaning. When illness is understood primarily as a biological malfunction to be corrected, it loses its role as a reminder of the limits of life. Questions that once arose naturally about pace of living, relationships, and values are no longer bound to the experience of sickness. they are postponed or treated as peripheral to the central objective: recovery as quickly as possible. In this context, modern humans are not biologically weaker. On the contrary, they possess more tools than ever to extend life and control pain. Yet they are often more fragile socially and psychologically in the face of illness. When responsibility is handed almost entirely to professional systems, individuals may become passive, waiting for solutions from the outside, rather than being held within networks of shared endurance. What has been exchanged, therefore, is not physical strength, but the capacity to situate illness within a shared narrative of life. In pre-modern societies, illness was part of an existential order, interpreted, shared, and accepted. In modern societies, illness is a problem to be resolved quickly, privately, and efficiently. Each approach carries its own strengths and limitations. The question, have we become weaker or simply different, can thus be answered in this way. We have become different because we have chosen a way of life in which illness is removed from the community in exchange for control and efficiency. In doing so, we have lost part of our ability to endure together, to see illness not only as an enemy, but as an experience that can reshape how we relate to ourselves and to one another.
It was late autumn.
What matters, perhaps, is not a return to the past, nor a rejection of modern medicine, but an awareness of the cost of privatizing and technologizing illness. Once that cost is understood, modern societies may begin to recreate, through new forms, some of the elements that once helped pre-modern communities endure vulnerability. Presence, witnessing, and the recognition that illness, however advanced our treatments may be, remains inseparable from human life itself. Before leaving this video, you might pause to ask yourself, in your own experience, what makes being ill most difficult? Not necessarily the pain itself, but perhaps the feeling of having to face it alone. If you wish, you can share that thought in the comments below. And if you found these perspectives worth reflecting on, you're welcome to continue along with the channel in future episodes. There, we'll keep revisiting familiar human experiences from angles that are rarely discussed, slowly and without rushing to conclusions.